1983, and it was formulated and put together by a group of scientists, credentialed scientists, men with letters after their name, who study things like chemistry and biology and zoology and these sorts of things, who were aware that mainline science was not doing the right thing when it comes to certain putative animals that are suggested to exist. And so the International Society was formed. It, for a while, was going strong. And they would have an international meeting somewhere each year. And that particular year, it was in Pullman. Now, when I went to that meeting, there was a whole group of people like we have here today, a mixed group, people who had studied Bigfoot, people who were just interested, students, and so forth. And I'll never forget, one of the highlights of the event was an argument that broke out between Rene de Hinden. In case you don't know who that is, he's a man, a Swiss man who came over to hunt Bigfoot. And he resided in Canada. Most of the time he was in this country, and he was as close as you could come to a full-time Bigfoot hunter, and was doing that years and years and years ago. He was contemporary with Roger Patterson. He, of course, was right there on the spot, studying the Patterson film from the get-go once it was made. He knew Roger, and he even bought rights to the still versions of the pictures of Bigfoot. He bought that from Patterson. And Bob Gimlin, of course, was involved in the filming, but Mr. Gimlin actually was not part of the loop once the film was being marketed. Bob Gimlin went back to his regular job as a cowboy. He still makes his living training horses. And he had gone out with Patterson for, well, approximately a year when they shot the fabulous film that we've all seen. Gimlin wasn't even involved in the marketing, and there was a time when Patterson was showing the film. Gimlin and he were kind of at odds for a while because of the fact that he had been kind of kicked out of the loop. And so there, Rene de Hinden stepped in, and he was a very busy guy and a clever man, and he managed to purchase the rights to the film, the still rights, for $1 from Bob Gimlin. And Bob Gimlin just said, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I've got my own work, I've got my horses, I've got my family, and I can't be chasing Roger all over the country worrying about that film. So Rene de Hinden at the symposium was particularly vehement in his opinions about scientists. And one of the things that happened was there was a great argument that broke out between him and Roy Mackal. Roy Mackal was a scientist from Chicago. He wrote a book about the Mokele Mbembe. That's the dinosaur that purportedly still lives in Africa. He had been very active in Loch Ness research, and he was one of the founders of the Cryptozoology Society. And so the thing that happened was this argument about amateurs versus professionals, credentialed scientists versus regular people who go out and hunt for Bigfoot. And I see that problem still exists today, in that some of us, like myself, who is not a credentialed scientist, but I am at least a folk scientist when it comes to Bigfoot. I've done the research. I know a little bit about the subject anyway. But I had a scientist in here from UC Santa Cruz recently, and he was just horribly arrogant and unbending and unwilling to even look at things before he made his mind up, and I was quite shocked by it. So what I want to present is there anything we can do to somehow, if anybody has any ideas, how we can work through some of this schism between a scientist versus a non-scientist, a Bigfoot researcher who does it as a hobby versus someone who does it full-time. Do you think there could be an organization formed Could there be an association? I know, Kathy, you, for example, started an association, the Alliance for Independent Bigfoot Researchers. Maybe you could tell us about how your group works.
Well, it's just a nonprofit organization that tries to bring together as many people as possible with different viewpoints to work together and to share evidence, because that's one of the problems that we have, but also to bring more science into what they do. So when you're taking a photograph of a footprint, you have to have some sort of scale there. When you're casting, you have to do it a certain way. And so we haven't done it in a little while, but we used to have classes. Several people have come up to me that attended those classes where you can learn how to properly map, how to take a good photograph, how to do all those things. And that's what we promote, is more science in Bigfooting.
So it's like you help to train amateurs in doing a more professional job.
Correct.
Correct. And establish some kind of format for it.
Yeah, and I have so many people who send audio, and the first thing about being a Bigfooter is you have to know your environment. You have to know what's a common animal sound. You need to know what a bear footprint looks like, because otherwise you're going to be driving the rest of us crazy, because I'm tired of having owl sounds sent to me. Learn what an owl sounds like, and that's what we do.
I'd like you to touch on what she said. I think from us that are amateurs and don't have the credentials, is kind of know where that line is. Don't make those determinations. Our job is to assess the viability, collect the evidence, and defer it, to someone who is credentialed for the processing part. I think is something that should be emphasized.
Yeah. Well, at one time I thought, geez, I wonder if I could get a hold of Lauren Coleman. Lauren Coleman has a museum in Maine. It's a cryptozoology museum. It, of course, features Bigfoot, but it has other cryptid animals as well. And he's, of course, an author of 30-some books on strange subjects, Bigfoot-type subjects and others. And I thought, what if we formed a museum association, and then maybe under the wing of that, we could somehow become some kind of clearinghouse to where there could be some kind of a peer observation. In other words, in the scientific community, you have you write a paper, you publish it for peer review, then your peers check your work to see if you've got all your I's dotted and your T's crossed, and if you're not making any incorrect assumptions or doing some bad math or any of these sorts of things. And we don't have really that happening other than Dr. Meldrum has recently started up an online newsletter. And why don't you tell us about that?
Well, it's much more than a newsletter. The intent is it to function as a refereed journal, an academic refereed journal. So unfortunately, this doesn't really provide a venue for the Bigfoot community at large to submit papers or reports or editorials or opinions for general consumption. It really is, the goal was to provide a venue for those academics primarily who wish to delve into this topic, but who recognize that the traditional outlets are going to be very difficult to navigate. They're very prejudicial against this subject matter right from the get-go. And so this provides at least an objective venue where I can shepherd a manuscript to legitimate credentialed reviewers who I am confident will provide objective feedback and peer review.
The peers are strictly within the scientific community.
To a large degree. Now, I'm not. I don't want to discourage individuals who, because of expertise or personal experience or qualifications, could not or could make a very substantial contribution. So we have taken submissions from people who don't have a lot of letters behind their names, but who have provided a very insightful, due to their professional expertise, whether it's in photographics or electronics or or whatever, to submit under varying categories too. I mean, we have we have essays, and we have editorials, and we have book reviews, and we have, in addition to solid research articles where there is a research question, experimentation, or description, and documentation.
So would you be in a position to publish Melba Ketchum's paper?
Certainly we would be in a position to. It would, she rightfully is, correctly is at least professes that she's attempting to have her paper published in a higher profile, because given the very controversial nature and the potential significance and impact of the results, publishing it in the RHI, the Relic Hominid Inquiry, would probably weaken that impact, because there would be a large number of people who would say that it didn't receive a rigorous peer review, and because this journal is specifically created to foster the research and dissemination of publications on the subject, then we would be biased in favor of publication. So no, I wouldn't expect her to, and I don't feel slighted in the least that she's made a couple of slight comments that she corrected when she educated herself about what the RHI was all about, with a little bit of guidance for me. But I think that the idea of a clearinghouse is good. It really, in my mind, Kathy hit the nail on the head, and that is, well, I was impressed. I attended some meetings here recently, and a researcher, an entomologist at University of San Francisco, or University of California at San Francisco, whichever I want to make systems. But in any case, he is researching the incursion of Africanized bees in North America, and it's a huge undertaking to try to track this, and so he has set up what he refers to as the citizen scientist participating in his research project. And he's created a web page, and it has instructional materials on how to collect, how to identify, how to preserve and package and mail to his lab these bees. What are the distinguishing characteristics and so forth. And then that data is entered, and the map shows exactly where the distributions are. And I thought, this is a very applicable model. And I would much rather use, instead of using the word amateur investigator, to use citizen scientist, because it doesn't have that pejorative quality to it. But non-professional investigators really do need to hone their skills. And as Kathy said, they need to become familiar with the natural history of their region. They need to become familiar with the flora and the fauna. They need to school themselves in some of the basic criteria for documenting evidence and collecting samples. You don't know how many times I get photographs sent to me. There was it depending on the source, obviously you're going to get all types, but this gentleman claimed that his footprint was 15 inches long, but there were oak leaves lying next to it that I've never seen get longer than 4 or 5 inches long of that variety. He said it was 15 inches long by 8 inches wide. Well, those proportions just don't fit. But yet there's no way to confirm or refute those allegations without, other than the proportionality, without a scale, an well-established scale. Just the simple thing of taking a picture directly over a footprint with a scale clearly in a replicable scale, not a pen, but something that has a standard size, like a coin or a dollar bill, or a readily available printed scale bar that you can purchase from any number of outdoor suppliers. That would be a huge advance in the accumulation of this kind of data.
Well, this is the kind of thing that groups could be doing, groups like Kathy's.
Yeah.
We do a little bit of this here. We've had sessions on casting tracks and taking evidence and this sort of thing. I just realized that I started this panel without introducing the people who are sitting here, which was pretty lame of me. This is Kathy Moskowitz-Strain. Kathy wrote a book all about Native Americans, cannibals, monsters, and so forth. A few years ago. It's a great book. You got to get one if you don't have one. She talks about 130 tribes and their Bigfoot stories and legends. Dr. Meldrum, of course, from Idaho State, is probably the most visible of all the academics who have taken the step onto the dark side and admit their interest in Sasquatch publicly. Bill Munns, an artist and special effects genius from Hollywood, who has been studying at length the Patterson-Gimlin film and can show us all this evening why it's not a guy in a costume. And he has written extensively on this and published pages and pages of documentation about this online for the last few years. It's called the Munns Report, which you can check out yourself. And please come and see his presentation tonight. And over here is Daniel Perez. I met Daniel Perez back in '89 at the symposium in Washington. He was about 17 years old at that time. And I got a picture of him holding the track. And he's been at it all this time. He's published a newsletter called the Bigfoot Time for how many years?
Since January of 1989.
So he has the longest going Bigfoot newsletter in the country. And then next to him is Bart Catino, my good friend and fairly local guy from Monterey. He's a BFRO member, and he's a member of our museum. He's a member of Kathy's Alliance, and he gets around, and he's a very dedicated researcher, and he's going to be sharing some of his latest evidence tonight. So that's our panel, and I'm the curator of the museum. And speaking of the Patterson film, I don't think there's anybody here that's likely to be much of a skeptic about the Patterson film. However, we know there still are plenty of skeptics out there, and we know that all you got to have is some guy step up and say, "Oh yeah, I wore the costume," and the news media are going to be all over it and take it as gospel. So my question is there any way that we could somehow, this is maybe part of the idea of having an alliance of some sort, or some sort of one place where the media could go. It seems like the media should be able to go to what's considered a reliable source to check on this stuff before they publish. So do any of you or anybody here have an idea what kind of a process we could go through, if there is one, where we could sort of canonize this one little bit of evidence once and for all, since it is the most compelling of all the evidence? Could that be done? Is there any way that could be said to be, well, 98% of all researchers agree this is the real deal, therefore maybe the news media should tend to look towards that as opposed to the latest guy who jumps up and says, "I wore the suit"? I mean, do you think it's possible?
Let me take that one. But first, this question ties into earlier campaign Jeff was addressing. Could some kind of organizational body be put together that certifies people, certifies processes, certifies evidence, and everything else? Now, I come from a profession of special makeup effects and such, where theory is nice, but bottom line, does it work or not, is life and death matter for us professionally. Reality has to work for us. And so I suppose that instills in me a certain amount of pragmatism when I say the solution you're looking for, step one is money. It is going to take a very, very substantial amount of money to set up a foundation or organization, and the use of that substantial amount of money then has the power to establish a certification process, either for academics or for citizen scientists, as you call them. A process that would certify a person in a certain area of expertise, so we can say, yes, this person is an expert in this process and thus can analyze this kind of data. Would certify investigator skills, would establish guidelines for how investigation fieldwork is done properly, like what Jeff was mentioning about scaling photographs, absolutely crucial as evidence. Another thing would be just another example of certifying something. Occasionally people find a trackway. They can cast individual tracks, but they can't cast the entire trackway. You don't have enough plaster, you don't have a bulldozer to lift it out. You'd have to make it 6 inches thick or reinforce it with steel, or its own weight would crack it. So you can't cast the ground between the two footprints, and that's half the study of a walk cycle, is to see the heel strike, the roll of the foot, the push off of the ball, but that's in relation to the distance to the next footprint. And if you don't have that data, then your study of that individual footprint isn't enough, because you don't have the data of the next one and the terrain in between. Now, no one's ever going to be carrying around enough plaster to cast a trackway. But what Jeff and I are working on right now is an alternate process, and we're going to be doing a prototype of it fairly soon. And that is, if you photograph the trackway correctly by literally walking along it with a camera and turning around, coming back the other way to catch the trackway from a variety of angles with a fairly high resolution medium, you can actually digitally reconstruct the entire trackway in 3 dimension in a computer. And then with computer-aided milling, as long as you can scale it in a real-world scale, you can actually rebuild the trackway. And we're going to be doing that with the trackway footage from the Patterson film. It's going to be 3 feet wide, 18 and a half feet long, and it's going to have all the footprints, all 4 that we know, including one with the plaster in it, and the half footprint that's at the end of the reel, unless I can find more footage and get the 5th footprint in its entirety. But we're actually going to rebuild the trackway in 3 dimension, full scale, so that for the first time, when it goes to Jeff's lab, he can actually study 1 foot impression in relation to the next. This has never been done before. It's equivalent to how they studied the Laetoli footprints in Africa. You know, it wasn't just a question of studying each print, they had to study them in relation to each other. Now, those are intact. You can still go there and actually study them in the ground, thankfully. But if someone were to find a trackway, and if they photograph it correctly, they would actually then be able to set up the data so that we can do a 3D stereophotogrammetry digital model of the trackway in high level detail, and then scale it in real world, and then machine mill it and actually produce a duplicate that has data that individual footprint casts would not be sufficient for. It wouldn't give us everything we need. So if researchers who are out in the field understood this technology, then all they have to do is know how to photograph it correctly. And from that point on, the rest of the process is now established after we do the prototype. But it's things like that which are going to take money. To build an organization that can establish these criteria, can educate the investigators or people who want to be certified investigators, to make sure the information is disseminated, to have the resources. Then let's say somebody finds a trackway and they photograph it correctly, but they can't afford the whole process next down the line. If the data was properly captured, then this organization could have funding, could then take it from there and take it through the rest of the process. So all of this, in my opinion, really boils down to one thing. This whole field rather desperately needs some kind of a very large infusion of money to form a foundation that can pull all this together properly. It's wonderful that everybody involved does most of it for free. I know that's a common skeptical, absurd lament that we're all just in it for the money. And all of the people who seem to think that I'm living in a 22-room mansion somewhere don't realize that aside from a small amount of money that I got from Monster Quest in 2009 and the recent research grant that Jeff was able to facilitate and I was able to receive some of the funds from, in that period in between, I've been living on Social Security and haven't earned a single penny for that 3.5 years of work in between. You know, this whole idea that we're getting rich selling our books and selling gas and making our, you know, it's just a total myth. The reality is what we're doing here, what Daniel has been doing with his newsletter and everything, what Bart's doing and everything, what we're doing here, we're doing because we're dedicated to the idea, but we can't take it to the next level without some kind of very, very aggressive funding that would be properly administered in an organization that does develop this area into a higher level of professionalism for all involved. So there's a lot of goals we can achieve to get to the end that you spoke of. But the bottom line is step one is money. And that's literally why we're not going to step two. You know? Now, you mentioned with the Patterson film specifically, same thing. If such an entity existed, then it could pull everything about the Patterson film into focus, and then the media would have somewhere to go, and all of the proof, the evidence, the certification, the evaluation, the peer review challenges, the responses to the challenges, everything pulled together could be in an organized format where they can see where it really stands in terms of what level of proof are we at. Are we at 80%, 90%, 95%, 100%? They'd be able to see it at that point. But the unfortunate reality is we're all hindered by the lack of money. And if it could be found and funneled into one responsible organization, that would take all of us to the next plateau of success and professionalism. So pragmatically, that's why we're not moving along faster.
Well, having operated this museum for 7 years, I've learned major lessons about lacks of money.
Yes.
And I think most really dedicated Bigfooters have also experienced that. And I guess that one of the reasons I highly identify with Roger Patterson, just because, well, I don't know how many of you have read, there's a book that was done, it's kind of a hit piece. The book primarily vilifies Patterson, vilifies his memory, calls him a con man, indicates that all the people he came in contact with who gave him money all felt like he'd ripped them off and all of this. Well, I was trying to get a man to come and speak to that today. His name is David Murphy, and for a number of years he was working on a authorized biography of Roger Patterson. And he met with Patterson's widow, Patricia Patterson, and she gave him materials and photographs. And 5 years ago, there was an event up in Willow Creek. I'm wearing the commemorative shirt. And that was an anniversary gathering about the Patterson film. And David spoke. And one of the things he pointed out was that he went to some of the same people who had been interviewed in this hit piece and said, you know, tell me about your experience with the author and how do you feel about what he said in the book. And David told us that almost to the person, everybody he went to who had been quoted or otherwise listed in the book as having a grudge against Roger, almost all of them were angry and said that that was not what they said, that he had taken their words out of context, he had twisted the meaning, And some of them said that if Roger came to me today, I would loan him this money again, right now, with even knowing all of this, because he was that kind of guy. So Roger Patterson had a passion, and he was on a vision quest like nobody's business, and he succeeded. And all that has been done by the lion's share of the media and so forth is to vilify him. So that's why we're having this gathering today, is also to give homage to Roger and what he accomplished. Because I can tell you there's thousands of people all around the world trying to do what he did, and very few have come close. If there's anything that needs to be canonized and made sort of official, it's this film. And I think when you see tonight the shots of Roger himself speaking, interviewing witnesses, and shots of him out in the woods hunting Bigfoot and so forth, you'll get a whole new view of the man himself and what he was like. And I'll tell you, if somebody were to, about a year ago, I had a little heart attack and just about died. And I'll tell you what, if somebody went and they were going to write a book about me, they would find plenty of people who would tell you that I owe them money. But I like to think that most of those people would also say, but that's okay, because Mike was an honest guy and he was just trying to prove something, you know? So it's real easy to take things and twist them and make people look bad, especially when you're dealing with rumor and innuendo. So anyway, we're trying to get at the truth here about this thing. So I have another thing I want to bring up. We have this whole DNA thing that's going on right now. And this has grown and grown over the last 3 years now. It started out with occasionally you'd hear a story about somebody who had a DNA test done, and it came back human, and so it must not be Sasquatch, it's probably contamination. So all the early ones were pretty much ignored offhand. But then, one of the problems inherent in DNA is that, and I heard this from a scientist from UC Santa Cruz just recently. He said that funny thing is that when you get a bone of a mastodon and you take it into a lab and you test it for DNA, 9 times out of 10 it comes out human. And he said it's because human contamination is everywhere, especially with bones, ancient bones, because these have been in museum collections for years, and scientists have handled them while examining them and looking at them, and this was all done prior to our knowledge of the importance of DNA. And so there's this huge component of human contamination all throughout DNA testing, and I don't think that the mass public has been made aware of that fact. And so the scientists who are working on this right now, this science is still in its infancy, DNA. They're still figuring out how to analyze it, how to work with it, how to figure out what's what, and to make it even more and more precise. And so this is an issue, and especially when they're trying to differentiate DNA of something that's in the family, in the hominoid family. So whether it's an ape or a human, we're talking about subtle differences on the DNA level. And if we got problems with contamination, obviously this is a can of worms. So this has been a problem since the beginning of attempts to test DNA samples for Bigfoot, this problem with differentiating it from contamination. Now, the newest person to jump into this bandwagon of testing of DNA, thank God, is a man named Brian Sykes. Brian Sykes is probably the most famous DNA scientist in the world. And he recently asked for some samples of DNA to test in his lab, and promises to forthwith publish a paper for peer review on his results. Dr. Meldrum is a part of this. He's associated with Dr. Sykes and spoke to him about this. And I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit more about that test that's undergoing here.
Well, for those of you who don't know who Brian Sykes is, you may have heard the titles of some of the books. One of the more famous ones is the 7 Daughters of Eve, and most recently, he published a book entitled DNA USA, where he traveled across the U.S. and sampled just a whole smattering of individuals of varying backgrounds and showed the remarkable melting pot that our nation is. It's a really interesting read. A lot of very intriguing anecdotes of his travels. And he was on a book signing tour through the States and was coming through Salt Lake City. And so I arranged at his invitation to come down and visit with him and his wife over lunch. And that lunch engagement stretched into an entire afternoon together discussing his next book project, in which he wants to investigate the introgression of modern human DNA with that of other modern hominids. And so he's intrigued by the prospects, by the evidence of introgression of human and Neanderthal DNA, and by the introgression of human and Denisovan DNA. And he had gotten wind from a couple of different people about the notion that Sasquatch might be the result of hybridization between humans and some other form. And I, quite frankly, shared with him my assessments and opinions of that hypothesis, but acknowledged that nevertheless it's out there, and warrants consideration. If for no other reason, then it would mean that you would be testing prospective Sasquatch hair samples. And so my participation has only been, I simply didn't want him to become, knowing the enthusiasm of the Bigfoot community, and sometimes academics not being aware of that are overwhelmed by the outpouring of interest from the community at large, offered to sort of be a clearinghouse and screen some of the hair samples so that because he had obviously a limited timeline and a limited budget, and he was splitting his attentions between these three major prongs of his project, and so probably was only going to ultimately test 3 to 5 perhaps samples of alleged DNA or alleged hair samples from Sasquatch. And so I didn't want to be spinning his wheels with things that were obviously from other animals, which could be differentiated on the basis of their morphology. So a few samples have already been sent his direction. Actually, contrary to expectation, I got many fewer submissions than I had expected to receive, and those that I did receive, quite a number of them, the majority of them, could easily be excluded on the basis of presence of guard hair and underfur and other characteristics that were non-primate in nature. So we'll see how it goes. I'm quite confident he'll follow through and in a very timely fashion. Results available. He may be somewhat guarded. I suspect since this is also part of a book project, he may guard some of his results until the time of publication. But given his prolific writing, I'm sure that the writing of this book is already well underway since our conversations about it, and I don't think we'll have to wait long to see that title come to life.
May I ask you then, because you indicated that you have doubts about a hybrid concept. Can we talk a little bit about, can we brainstorm a little bit here about what DNA might tell us? What can it tell us? And what is it likely to tell us? And what is your spin on that?
Well, the two principal things it can tell us is whether or not there is a novel species at hand, and two, where does that yet to be fully recognized species fit in the family tree. With the sequence data, then that even of an unknown species, the sequence could be compared to other known sequences, and what we call shared derived characteristics, features that are uniquely shared by species that have emerged from a common ancestor. And so with knowledge of those, the distribution of those characteristics within the sample and a series of knowns, then the unknown sample can be placed within the knowns in a reasonable fashion. So it could tell us whether Sasquatch is the sister group to modern humans, whether it's the sister group to Asiatic apes or African apes, or if it lies outside them, or whatever, in that sense.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Given that the Sasquatch phenomenon is global, and of course has been going on for a long time, we have Yerims, Yetis, everywhere on the planet. There's a local name to describe this type of ape-like being we're seeing. It hasn't been established. I personally feel that it's quite likely that there's more than one animal that's being seen and characterized as being called a Bigfoot or a Yeti or
More
whatever.
than one species of animal.
More than one
Yeah.
species of animal. So when you're talking about the orang pendek in Borneo, maybe that is going to be different than the Yeti in the Himalayas, which in turn is different from the Sasquatch of North America.
Right. Well, that's the only proposition that makes sense, yeah. And that's a common misnomer, and I've been guilty perhaps of even falling into the colloquialism and perpetuating that misconception, because I've used the title of the presentation, the Sasquatch the Global Phenomenon. And in that sense, Sasquatch means Sasquatch-like creatures, Sasquatch, or in Ivan Sanderson's vernacular, ABSMs. And,
Mystery primates.
mystery primates, or
Yeah,
whatever,
as
or
Russell
relic
supposed.
hominoids. See, now is the term that I'm pushing in the context of the relic hominoid inquiry. But yes, we're talking about certainly about very different. If in fact all these different forms exist, then yes, the orang pendek may be a relic Homo floresiensis. Sasquatch may be a Gigantopithecus or an early hominid offshoot like robust Australopithecus. The Almasti may be a relic Neanderthal. The Yeren may be a sibling species of Sasquatch that has a circum-Pacific distribution, but maybe they're different subspecies, maybe they're different species now because of the period of separation and restriction in gene flow.
Yeah.
The abominable snowman may be a different ape-like creature altogether, as evidenced by
On that television show that I saw you on, what was it called? The Definitive Guide?
yeah.
There was a man there, I forget his name, and he had another man who was, I think, an anthropologist from Northern University up in British Columbia or someplace.
Right.
And he spoke about the Squamish Indians, was it? And how they had a vision quest that the shamans would go out in the woods, become at one with the animals, and that after doing this for 10 years, living alone in the forest, they
Paired, at least.
yeah. So, in other words, what I have suggested, based on some of the things I've heard and so forth, from eyewitnesses who've come into the museum from different places, I have suggested that there might be feral humans in the mix. And when I say that, what I'm getting at is that there may be people who have lived off the grid, maybe have indulged in some inbreeding, have gotten to the point where they speak in guttural versions of language as we know it. When you see them from a distance, they're so wild-looking and dirty and hairy, and maybe even are wearing tattered clothes, or maybe even have had a case of spontaneous hypertrichosis, and they now have larger amounts of body weight. Because I know there has been some studies on that. But anyway, just the idea, and I'm not saying 70% of Sasquatch are feral humans, but I'm saying maybe there's 5% of sightings are actually wild people who just act and look so animal-like that people construe that as a Sasquatch. And that kind of goes along with what this guy was suggesting with the Native American element.
Right.
So what I'm getting at is, so if we took samples that people have collected from all over the planet that are mystery primates, And then we brought them into one big DNA lab, and we started checking them out, and we sequenced them, and we started collecting, looking at the gen bank and comparing it, and I think it's quite likely there could be half a dozen or maybe even a greater number of different animals that are being construed as a Bigfoot by the person who sees it.
Oh, you mean here in North America? Or
North
worldwide?
America and out of the country.
Well, sure. Well,
But
sure.
even in North America, I think you could have maybe a relict hominid as well as a feral person, some sort of unclassified ape that could exist. And then to throw another one in the mix, the idea that exotic animals are brought into the country. You've got a chimpanzee, it looks so cute in its diaper. Then it grows up and it can pull your arm off or bite your face off. So you take it and you let it go in the woods because you don't want to take care of it anymore and you're afraid of it. And you don't want to get fined for having an exotic, illegal pet. And bingo, somebody looks out their back window and there's a chimpanzee. And they catch a glimpse of it. And then they report a Bigfoot sighting.
I was going to tell you, so going through this process, we got quite the education. I think as most of you know, Lord Sierra's team, we're just trying to get to circumstantial, non-circumstantial evidence. We unilaterally multiple independent labs just to get to the truth of those samples. And what's blown me away is there's a perception that DNA is very easy to figure out, and no, it's not. It's very complicated. There's sometimes multiple contributors. You've got contamination issues. You have, with some objects, you have mold degradation is another villain that they have to contend with periodically. So we're going through a process right now. I mean, not hitting to any results at this point. It's going to be 110% transparency, but in the whole process of how they do it, even mitochondrial, explaining to somebody mitochondria, which really just tells you what the original mother is in the lineage. That could be 50,000 years back. Nuclear DNA really breaks down and tells you what's there. It's a very, in learning, it's a very complicated process given by the education. We eventually release all the communications back and forth. I think it's going to be good for the field, so people are going to be able to see how that process unfolds, the communication goes back and forth from the labs and the stages to get to where, trying to get a definitive answer. So, and I always, one of the fascinating studies that what if they just found out, I think we were on the body research together, I'd say about a little over a year ago, was they found out that all current living polar bears, original mother was an Irish black bear, which was stunning. It looks absolutely nothing like a polar bear, but it just gives you an idea of where we might be, headed with some of these results.
Yeah, so it's pretty hard to predict what this DNA might end up showing us, but I doubt it's going to be just one animal. All the sightings around the world are going to be this one species.
Oh no, yeah, as long as you talk about all around the world, I think it highly unlikely that there's going to be more species on North America.
Oh, yeah.
That's just my opinion, but I think that we're talking when the credible evidence is separated from the more suspect evidence, I don't see any real substantial support for other forms of, unless you're talking about a feral chimpanzee or some known species that is an exotic that's been released.
Well, we have a picture in the other room in the museum of the Mayaka ape.
Yeah. The Ripley's Believe It or Not exhibit. That's hoax. It's a hoax. It's a 100% hoax.
And who proved that?
Well, there are photos in circulation of that exhibit. It's in multiple.
I've tried to find
it. It's in multiple Ripley's. I'll find it. Yeah. Someone said, I think it was Brian Smith in Walla Walla.
Because I keep hearing that, but I can't find the proof.
And it's a slightly different hair color because it was in a different city, but it's the exact same setup, the exact same palms. It's a hoax.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that Dr. Sachs was going to publish his findings in a book. He's not going to.
Oh no, I'm sure he'll do peer review as well. But so yeah, you're right. That's a good point. So the results will probably be released in that format, but he may
process of how he got there. Okay.
Right.
Because
But you're right. No, you're right. No. Yeah, he's extensively published. That's a good point.
Hopefully you could hear me loud enough. I just wanted to get back onto the Patterson-Gimlin film. Most of you know a great deal about the film by reading books, magazines, seeing it on TV, and the internet. I wanted to kind of fill in some blanks. When Bill Munns is making mention of the film of the foot tracks, there were 2 films shot on that day. There's one film of the subject, and there's one film of the tracks that were in the ground. That second film was loaned to the BBC after Roger Patterson died. So the second film is like more than likely with the BBC in London, England. That's one point. Second point, the business about the book that was published, written by Greg Long about Roger Patterson. Yes, it was really a poorly written book in the sense that he attacked Roger not so much on the film but everything else, and in that sense I don't think it was a fair review of Roger Patterson. But in Greg Long's book, the person that's identified as the person in the suit is Bob Hieronymus. So a fellow by the name of Roger Knights in Seattle, Washington, more than anybody else, put out a pamphlet that he released in Yakima, Washington in 2009. I mean, really going going to great extent over the various points that Bob Hieronymus has claimed as to where he was, etc., in relationship to the Patterson-Gimlin film. And Bob Hieronymus makes numerous contradictions. So basically, you could just sidestep him altogether as a candidate for the subject in the film. The other point I wanted to make is that a lot of people claim that they're doing research on the film, but that you kind of wonder exactly what they're doing. And for the greatest amount of time, no one knew who wrote the original newspaper article that was published October 21st, 1967. There was no byline attached to the newspaper article, Mrs. Bigfoot is Film, that was published in the Eureka Times-Standard one day after the film. So, and it just got kicked around for probably 30 years. And so I finally decided in 2006 on one of my trips up north to go into one of the libraries, I guess it was the Humboldt County Library, to see if I could find out who Roger Patterson spoke with to the newspaper the night he got the film. And so that person's name is Al Tostada. He was the guy that wrote the article that never had the byline. Everyone thought for the longest amount of time that the person that was associated was their resident newspaper Bigfoot writer, the late Andrew Gonzoili. It was not. It was a fellow by the name of Al Tostado. So I had a friend see if we could track down this Al Tostado because we wanted to find out what all he knew about what he actually put in print and what he didn't put in print. But he's deceased. So basically, I'm trying to follow everything out as far as you can go until it dead ends. The third point I wanted to bring up is the route that Roger Patterson said he came out of Bluff Creek when he got the famous movie. According to Al Hodgson, who's still living in Willow Creek, Roger Patterson told him, we went over the Bald Hills Road out to the coast to Oric and then down Highway 1 to Eureka and then back into Willow Creek. So that is a story that you can test. In 2004, in October, I took my Ford Ranger truck, not the one you see out here, but a different truck, and I got my truck in there with one of the persons that was in Willow Creek who was actually on the film site November 5th of 1967, about 15 days later, and his name is Richard Henry. And I asked him, I said, well, would you go, we're going to go into the film site, we're going to put a stopwatch on it, take the odometer readings on the car, and we're going to go over that route. Because Roger Patterson said that he spoke with Al Hodgson shortly after the store closed, Al Hodgson's variety store, at 6 p.m. So I'm saying, can you come out of Bluff Creek, get to the coast, go over the Bald Hills Road, down the coast, mail the film from Eureka, and then back into Willow Creek. So Al Hodgson is a very good source of information. I have no doubt that if Roger told him that's the route he took, that Al was being very reliable in relating that story, because I heard it from Al Hodgson several times as to how they got out of that area. But the fact of the matter remains, you can't do it. You can't go that route, go out to the coast, go down to Eureka, and then back on Highway 299, back to Willow Creek, and meet Al Hodgson and his wife and his boys shortly after 6 p.m. The same day the film was made. It's a physical impossibility. You'd have to have in Indianapolis 500 cars to do it. So that's another thing. So in other words, when you find out these stories about it, the things that you can test, you try to test. So that's one of the things that I tend to work on. The last thing I wanted to bring up is that when you're in a discussion about the subject matter, the Patterson-Gimlin film, it's always neat to say, well, what is your reference? What is your citations on the matter? So over the years, I compiled the largest specific bibliography on the Patterson-Gimlin film. So there's probably now close to 300 citations specifically just on the film on original sources. So that's what I wanted to add, or at least fill you in on like some of the kind of stuff that I tend to zero in on in terms of if it's something that you could test, let's do it. And Bill Munns has done stuff of that nature, but far more advanced than the stuff I do. So that's what I wanted to add.
Well,
Quick question on the timeline. So how far off is it? I mean, I'm
Oh,
somewhat
it's-
familiar with that area, and it seems like it's like a couple hours. Probably.
No, I think we arrived. I think we arrived back in Willow Creek probably after 10 o'clock.
Yeah. Okay. So, any idea what was going on there?
I think somehow Al got in his mind that this is what Roger told him. And Roger, we know now that Roger wasn't in the Bluff Creek area just one time. He was there at least, I think, 3 times. So maybe it was on a different trip that maybe somehow Al got the stories mixed up. I don't know. But Al is very, very, how could you say? I consider Al Hodgson to be a very reliable source. So if that's what he told Roger, if Roger told Al that, I believe it's so. But in terms of a physical possibility, no, you can't go that route.
well,
I want to clarify for something. You said Highway 1. It's actually
There,
over the
right.
back out there. You come off of Bald Hills Road, turns into Redwood Road, which runs along Redwood Creek, and then it eventually dumps into Highway 1.
well, I have something to say about that. I interviewed Al Hodgson years ago, 89, as a matter of fact. I was coming back from the Bigfoot Symposium in Pullman. I had been in Al's place prior to that when I visited the museum, the Willow Creek Museum. And so I knew Al was very much into this, and he knew people in the community. He knew John Main and so forth. So I'm in my little Honda Civic. I drive up to Al's place, and I went in. I said, "Hi, Al," you know, and he kind of recognized me, but you know, it's not like oh yeah, Mike. He just said hello, you know, and I told him, I said, I was just up at Pullman. Oh, I wish I could have gone. I'm really sorry I couldn't get there, you know. Man, tell me about it. And so I filled him in on how it went in Pullman. And then I said to him, oh, while I was there, I purchased a Gigantopithecus skull from Grover Krantz. Would you like to see it? Oh my God, of course I would. So I took him outside and I opened the trunk of the car and I brought out, it's in the museum in the front room, I brought out this skull that I'd purchased from Grover and showed it to Al, and he was all excited about it, and he said, geez, would you mind making me making a photo of that and sending it to me? Because I'd like to put it in my store next to my plaster cast. And I said, sure, I'll do that for you, Al. And so I made a photo and I sent it up to Al. And he had it in the store for a while. Well, 2 years ago, a year ago, sometime in the last couple of years, Al came down to visit his relatives who live in Cupertino. He has a son over there. And I got a call from the son. He said, hey, my dad's here, Al Hodgson. Oh, of course, I know Al. He said that he wants to come and see your museum. Sure, bring him on over. It'd be great to see him. So he comes over to the museum, you know, and I go out and I greeted Al and I said, hi Al, you recognize me? No. You don't remember me? Well, maybe it's the beard, you know, I didn't look quite like this back then. I said, do you remember when I showed you the Gigantopithecus skull from Pullman? No? What I'm getting at is that people, as they age, their memories can fade, and they can have memories that overlap that then get confabulated together, and the memory then twists, and they can have their timing off. When I interviewed Al at that time, and I've got to look for the tape, it's buried in my file in there, he told me about speaking with Roger, and after the filming, the day after it happened, he told me, he said, well, when my wife and I rode home after talking to Roger, and he told me, Roger was all animated, he was all excited, like you would expect, you know. And he said, so I said to Wilma, what do you think? Do you think he really got a photo of that thing? And she said, well, either he did or he was on LSD, because I never saw anybody that wildly excited before. And as I recall, he told me then that they returned home from Willow Creek later in the evening. It was like way dark. It was like 10 o'clock, something like that. And he said that Bob and Al went back to the campsite after that. But they had been with him in Willow Creek pretty late in the evening. And spent a good deal of time telling them the whole story. So this stuff about, when you hear this, he said, there's the other issue. Right from the get-go, Roger Patterson said his horse rolled over on top of him. Bob Gimlin said that never happened. You got a problem. And of course, skeptics point to that and go, see, one of them's lying, they're both lying. Well, if you know anything about people's observations of events, you get a room full of people and have them observe an event, and you're going to get a different story from every one of them. So what I'm getting at, let me finish. What I'm getting at is that these things get confabulated, they get changed, and to be pointing fingers at somebody who's 80 years old and saying because they didn't remember it exactly the way they did 30 years ago is a bum charge. And so what Bob Gimlin might remember today is not necessarily going to be exactly what happened 45 years ago, because his memory could have shifted a little bit. And as far as Patterson going down, horses can go down flat on the ground and bounce right back up in seconds. So Bob Gimlin could have easily been fighting with his horse, watching out for the horse that he was towing, trying to keep it under control. Roger goes down, which he did, bounces back up, and Gimlin never sees it. But Gimlin swears Roger didn't go down. Roger says he did. Roger claimed that he had a stirrup that proved it because it was flattened. I don't know whatever happened in the stirrup.
Circumstances
So,
of heightened anxiety and adrenaline, and
exactly.
You don't remember. You always think you will, but I know from personal experience when I've been in something traumatic happening, you don't remember clearly. The person next to you remembers it differently.
Yeah, so people who make arguments will say, well, Cy McCoy said this and he said that, but it's contrary to what Roger and Bob said. Well, so what? These are, who's to say which of their memories is the more accurate one? When it's he said versus he said. One of them may have an actual memory that's correct, but who's to say which one it is? And especially 45 years later. So, no, the Patterson-Gimlin film should be based on what's on the film and nothing more. The story of going over Bald Hill or not, or what, all of that stuff is superfluous to the film itself, and Bill's got that nailed. So, I think that Bill's going to end all this, and we're going to get on. And if we can't do it officially, at least among us, we can canonize it. Did you have a comment?
There's a lot of data around Sasquatch, around Bigfoot, but deciding what's data and what's evidence, that's where I see what you were talking about as being the challenge of the community. Like, so how does something pass the test between being anecdotal to being evidence?
And sadly, a great deal of Bigfootology is anecdotal. I mean, that's a fact.
I wanted to add one more thing just in closing, is that when you're doing the research or investigation specifically as it relates to the Patterson-Gimlin film, it's always the best thing, or in any line of work, to go to the primary sources. And I was lucky that the individual he had mentioned earlier, Sil McCoy, who's now passed away, he was, I guess the fire, had something to do with the fire for the United States Forest Service at the Lower Trinity Ranger Station, just up Highway 96 as it tees off of 299. And so when I spoke with him in 1989 or late 80s when he was still living, he told me specifically that when he saw Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin that night, that Roger was limping. And then I asked him, I said, well, why was he limping? And he said that Roger said he fell off the horse and his foot got caught in the stirrup. In June of 2009 was my first and only opportunity in Yakima to meet Roger Patterson's widow, Patricia Patterson. And I brought up this issue in kind of passing, and I asked, did when Roger got home, was there, he got home within, I guess, a day and a half after the film was shot. I said, did you notice Roger limping? Did you notice anything about a stirrup? Because here's the wife, and she would notice those things. And she said something like, well, he didn't seem like he was walking normal. She didn't say anything like a limp, but something to the effect that it didn't seem like he was walking his normal walk. Because here's the spouse that sees him all the time. So the business about the horse falling to the side or falling over the stirrup, I would suspect, based on additional testimony from Sil McCoy, that something like that very probably happened, as they said.
Yeah, the fact that Bob Gimlin didn't see it, he's going to tell the truth from his point of view. Roger didn't fall down. I didn't see him fall down. He doesn't necessarily say, I didn't see him, but that doesn't mean he didn't do it. I mean, you don't talk like that. And in a normal conversation, you just say, he didn't fall down as far as I can say. That's about the extent. And yet people will take that and try to make a huge case out of it, that he's lying. That's why Bob Gimlin stopped talking to the press many, many, many years ago. And it wasn't until 2003 when he came out and went to Willow Creek for the symposium there that he actually made himself available to the public, and we're so lucky he did that, because he's a great ambassador for the film. And anybody who meets him, if they still think that the film is fake, I just don't know how they can do it. You can't imagine a nicer, more believable man than Bob Gimlin. And sorry he couldn't make it today. He wanted to come, but he had other obligations. So. How are we doing on time?
I got 3:36 according to the computer.
Okay. Well, unless anybody else has any questions, yes.
Just real quick, given that there's a limited amount of time, limited amount of money, just like Mr. Munns mentioned about the fact that it takes money to do these things, it seems like there's an awful lot of effort and time that's put into the Patterson-Gimlin film, and I understand there's a lot of information that's been gleaned, but at some point, do you think that we've gotten what we could out of it? It's time to put those effort and energy into more research, new research, and I know there's a lot that still goes on, but at some point, will we have gotten to the point where we've gleaned what we could and it's time to move on?
I'll tell you that tonight. Part of my presentation answering that very question.
Well, I think with this DNA too, we have a whole new realm opening up, and so I think that in the future there'll be a lot more DNA testing that's done, and we'll utilize that. And I think they're going to be working out these little problems with analyzing hair more efficiently and working through the human contamination. I think that people like Brian Sykes are working on that every day in their labs. They're working on, further developing the skills of DNA sequencing.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to adjourn the meeting, and we'll see you all this evening.
Cool. I didn't want you to do that.
Every time I hear that come up, it just kind of...
No, I really like the work you've done, and I think, to really get the public support for Bigfoot, we need academia involved.
Sure, of course.
Mike mentioned about, this Patterson-Gimlin not getting their stories straight between one another.
Well, only on minor details.
Minor details, but, that's all, credibility.
Yeah.
Like, I work in weather and climatology.
Right.
And there's a lot of, criticism and skepticism that goes on for it, too.
Sure.
And it all boils down to, just that credibility.
The consistency, absolutely, absolutely. But I think his point is also, while the context and that credibility is essential to address, ultimately it comes. I mean, even if their stories in details do have discrepancies, if you can't explain, if you can't show how that subject could be replicated by a costume, then you have to account for it.
Absolutely.
And that's the point. Would you like this personalized too?
Yeah, my name's Larry.
Larry. Would you like two? Okay.
Yeah, Larry.
All right.
Great. No, and I agree. I think that's some really strong evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think it really is. The circumstances were just so serendipitous.
Yeah.
The fact that he had a cine camera with probably the best film stock that was available at that time.
Yeah.
And he had a lens that didn't require focusing, and it's just amazing.
Oh yeah. And when you're in the heat of the moment of something like that too, you get this tunnel vision. So I could see how they wouldn't know what the other was doing. That's for sure.
In talking with Bill here over the past couple of days, he made a comment that I found really amazing, and that was as he's looking at the film and he's able to interpret the path that Roger followed across the creek, and even some of his body movements. There was a point where his finger was on the trigger and had just momentarily depressed it and slipped off, and so it started and stopped, and before he got into position. But he made the comment, he said it's clear to him that Roger was absolutely desperate to get in position to get a shot of this creature, and it just, even subtle things like that speak to its authenticity and the credibility of the
I like being able to see the muscle movement too.
Oh yeah. And that's kind of where my expertise comes in.
Yeah.
And the familiarity with human anatomy and all, and great ape anatomy, and there are just so many details that a film or a costume, especially a costume of materials of that period, just would never cut it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm excited to see if we get some better evidence, since everybody has an iPhone now,
Yeah.
high resolution cameras. I have a HD camera that I wear when I go mountain biking.
Yeah.
Sooner or later we'll get this. That's excellent. Thanks for the
You're welcome.
book and the autograph. I
You're
really
welcome.
appreciate that.
You're welcome. Enjoy it. Let me
Good
know.
luck out there.
Okay, thank you.
That's why they're going to grant